Today we're going to talk about landmarks in Black Hills history, pioneer cabins. It's a new topic for me, one that I got interested in because I've been stumbling around the Black Hills, trying to catch up on the little odds and ends of history that I've always avoided in the past. And one of those is visiting museums more thoroughly, checking out all the historic cabins and landmarks that exist, and take pictures of these locations. Then I discovered as I researched these cabins at each location, I've discovered that what they have posted on the signs don't always agree with what I research and discover later. So there's always a discrepancy, or there seems to be always a discrepancy in what is posted and what is the truth in my humble estimation. So it got me wondering, why were these cabins saved? What's important about these historic cabins that were saved? What claims are made about them? And where perhaps do these claims go in error? And as I point out faults or mistakes in their story, I don't want to insult any historical society member that may be here, and I apologize if I do up front. And I want to be clear about this. I'm only looking at cabins that have been saved by communities, historical societies, museums, those kind of cabins. There's lots of beautifully restored cabins in the hills that are privately held. I don't talk about those. These are the ones that are publicly displayed, that are on display. As I organized my cabins, as I thought about historic cabins in the Black Hills, I decided that I need to organize my talk, and I've organized it two ways. The one way is I've categorized them. What era of the Black Hills history did it serve? What was their purpose? And I've come down to topics such as some were an exploration cabin. They came with the exploration era, a few of them that were saved. We have a lot of gold rush cabins. Then we have a few homestead cabins, and then some tourist cabins. Yeah, I could be here for about 2 or 3 hours covering all those, but we'll see how far I get with all those categories. And then I'm going to kind of, like the gold rush cabins, do a location by location survey of gold rush cabins, because those are the most often saved. Having said that, we'll start with this cabin. I'm not sure how many of you have seen this cabin, but this is right on the edge of the Black Hills. This is at the Newcastle Museum, the Hannah Miller Museum, a wonderful museum if you've ever been to Newcastle. And it's, as you can see by the sign, called the Jenny Stockade Cabin, built in 1875. The Jenny Stockade Cabin was built on Beaver Creek, and I have a map coming up real shortly that will show that. And it was built in June of 1875 as part of the Newton Jenny expedition. As you may know, as you probably know, Walter P. Jenny led an expedition of scientists to the Black Hills in the summer of 1875, escorted by 400 troops under Colonel Dodge, to verify if there was gold in the Black Hills, to determine if there was actually value in the Black Hills, to try to determine a price if the Black Hills would be sold by the Lakota to the white invaders. So the Jenny group came up with Dodge, and they ended up at Beaver Creek. They built a stockade about 30 by 40 feet in measure, or yards, pardon me, like 30 by 40 yards. And according to most reports, they built 2 cabins. One for sleeping quarters, which this cabin is supposedly, and one for a storehouse. And they were in the hills for 4 months, touring the hills. And this was one of their areas they stored supplies, coming back to it as they went through the Black Hills. In October, they returned to Fort Laramie where they started, leaving the cabin and the stockade behind. Here's a map that kind of better shows, and I owe this colorized version of the map to my friend Paul Horsted. He so kindly supplied it to me. Right up here, you can see Jenny Stockade out on the edge of the Black Hills, and the red line indicates that it sat on the Cheyenne to Deadwood Trail for a time. This is where the cabin was built. It was on Beaver Creek, and it's interesting. Beaver Creek, if you see it south of the hills, and you cross it when you're on US 85, and people would follow Beaver Creek to the hills. There's an easy access point, ending up here where the Jenny Stockade is. So this was kind of a handy stopping spot. And actually Beaver Creek has a branch up here that goes up this way, as you can see it on the map. Anyway, even before the Newton Jenny expedition got here, the Lieutenant Warren, and he had a topographical engineer survey come through in 1857. They stopped there 18 years before the Newton Jenny expedition stopped there and built a small stockade. In fact, Colonel Dodge, when he wrote his memoirs about the Newton Jenny expedition, said, "We camped on the same ground that the Warren expedition camped 18 years prior." And not only that, other groups stopped there. After this was, the Newton Jenny group left after the 4 months of surveying the hills, then the stage came through in 1876, 1877, 1878, and used this cabin supposedly as a stage stop as they went up to the northern Black Hills. So this is a very active location for a time out here where the Jenny Stockade was built. After the Cheyenne to Deadwood Trail was no longer used this as the primary route, as the stagecoaches started taking a different route into Black Hills. In fact, by 1878, the stagecoaches would take this cutoff from Hat Creek to Horsehead and come through Rapid City as a better route. So by 1878, the spot at the Jenny Stockade was not as popular. At that time in 1878, the cabin was incorporated into this ranch. This ranch was established in 1878. It's still off of US 16, just east of Newcastle. It's known as the LAK Ranch. That ranch name comes from three cattlemen who started it by the name of Lake, Hallerton, and Spencer. So the cabin was in the middle of this ranch. And so the story goes, after all its history being a supply center, a stage stop, that it became a living quarters for the ranch. And to make the bigger living quarters, the ranch people blew it out to 8 rooms. And I'm not sure how you take a 1-room cabin and make it 8 rooms, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But they used it 8 rooms. And then they decided to build a regular house. And they moved the cabin into what they called the hog pens. I guess that's self-descriptive. And after being there for a number of years in the 1920s, they decided there's some historic value here, and so they decided to donate it to Newcastle's 20th Century Club in 1929, who took the cabin apart, moved it into the city park in Newcastle. And it sat in the city park in Newcastle 53 years. And for 53 years, it was there. It was used 40 of those years by the Chamber of Commerce as a welcome center. And then they eventually decided to expand the library, which was next door. And so they turned it over to the Weston County Historical Society, which then moved it out to the Adam Miller Museum. So this cabin's been moved 3 times. And they put it out here at the Historical Society area, and they rebuilt it, restored it, and they recreated the interior of the cabin. This part of the cabin is not really accessible. The young lady who runs the museum let me in there to take a picture behind the plexiglass. But we were standing there in the cabin, and I said, boy, this cabin's moved a lot. How much of this is original? And she goes, I don't know. And I said, this cabin was turned into 8 rooms, and now it's down to 1 room. How does that work? She goes, well, they blew out this wall, they blew out this wall, and I said, well, to blow the walls back, there must not be much original. No, probably not. And so we're looking at a rendition then of the Jenny Stockade cabin, or was also known as the Camp Jenny cabin, but it got to be known as Jenny Stockade. But it was an exploration cabin. It was involved heavily with the New Jenny expedition, and it was built June 1875, one of our first early cabins in the Black Hills. So historically very significant, a nice place to visit. The second cabin I want to talk about briefly is in Custer. And you might know this cabin quite well. It's here in Wade Park. Wade Park, of course, has the marked period of Horatio Ross, the discovery of gold in 1874, right in front of the courthouse, the Custer County Courthouse. And there's the cabin we're going to talk about in Wade Park. You know, Henry Wade, who this park is named after, was a very prominent citizen in Custer. He was a county judge in Custer. He donated this park to Custer, and he was intimately involved in determining the historic nature of this cabin. This is known as the Dr. Flick cabin, and it's got 1875 above the door. The Dr. Flick cabin is one that I really questioned quite a bit. You read the City of Custer's website, and I read it last night just to make sure it hasn't changed. It says, the Dr. Flick cabin was the first building erected in the Black Hills. Okay, whenever you say the first building erected in the Black Hills, doesn't that make you take pause? How do you know that? And we'll talk about how we know it wasn't here in a second for sure. And then it goes on to say Dr. D.W. Flick built in of substantial hand-hewn logs and designed it as a family home. Well, maybe so. But let's talk about this claim of being the first building erected in the Black Hills, a hard one to prove. This is a picture of early Custer. And we do know that Dr. Flick arrived there early. we do know he built a cabin somewhere. But of all those cabins, how do you know which was the first? And I think a number of them survived, as we'll find out, because Custer wasn't really ravaged by fire like a lot of other places. So it makes you wonder how you determine which is the first and which was really Dr. Flick's. And it goes back to this early discovery of the Flick cabin in 1875. It looks very much like it is today. And this is when Dr. Flick, this is when Henry Way started pushing the Dr. Flick cabin as being original. We'll talk more about some contradictions there. How did Henry Way determine, and he's the one that determined this was the first cabin in Custer. And it's an interesting story. If you follow the papers, and I did some paper research for the 1920s, Henry Way bought a home close to French Creek. It's not its original location. And he described it as a vine-covered cottage. It had siding on it. And so in 1923, he decided to remove the siding. And by golly, they found logs. And oh my gosh, look at this. This is an old log cabin. And then, after he removed the siding, he said, well, this is down by French Creek. It's an area where lots was going on. This may be the first cabin, because the first cabin had to be built someplace in this area. So in the 1920s, he went and asked other people he knew, pioneers from Custer, is this the first cabin? They said, well, could be. So after he found no contradiction to the fact that it wasn't the first cabin, he said, it's the first cabin. And so thanks to Henry Way, we've got the first cabin. Now, oddly, if you look carefully at this picture, there's the name Shanklin up here above the door. And if you really read what Henry Way was coming up with, he actually puts the Shanklin family in there, not the Flicks. And I've never really put the two. Now, who was Shanklin? He was an early pioneer of Custer. Came there right after the Gordon party. And this baby who lived there, not really the Flicks, but somehow Dr. Flick got put in this cabin, when it was built. And Henry Way did move the cabin to its current location, so it's not at its location. Once Henry Way discovered it's an old cabin, convinced himself it was the first cabin, it was turned into the Henry Way Museum, which was the start of the Custer Museum. If you study the Henry Way cabins or the Flick cabins history, you'll find a couple stories that are interesting to follow with. One of these stories is that, and this is commonly written out there and repeated, and I tried to track this story down, and I think it started with Annie Talent. Annie Talent wrote that book, The Last Hunting Ground of the Dakota, Black Hills, the Last Name of the Dakota, in 1899. And she wrote this story about the Flick cabin. She says, Dr. Flick started building a cabin in Custer, it could be this cabin, in August 1875. Okay, we'll take pause right there. We already know the new Jenny cabin was out there June 1875, so if this was started in August 1875, that disqualifies it from being the first erected. Okay, we'll start right there. And it says, but Dr. Flick didn't get the cabin done. Instead, he had to leave the Black Hills. As you probably know, General Crook was in the Black Hills removing the trespassers of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that summer, and he was stationed out of Custer, and Flick left with him. He left his unfinished cabin behind. But when Crook left with his army command, he left Captain Pollock behind with a troop of men to continue to try to enforce the Treaty of 1868 and keep trespassing miners out as much as they could. Well, Pollock saw this, according to Annie Talent, saw this unfinished cabin, and he finished it. He wanted to have a headquarters. So Pollock finishes it, or his men finish it, he moves in. Well, then in November 1875, as we know, President Grant ordered the army out. Pollock packs up, leaves, and the gold rush starts in all ferocity. And prospectors start coming back to Custer, reclaiming what they left behind, and new ones arriving. And who moves into the cabin but the old poet scout himself, Captain Jack Crawford. He takes ownership of this empty cabin that Captain Pollock left behind. Well, he's in there, and Dr. Flick returns, according to Talent, back to Custer in April 1876, comes to his cabin, which somehow been miraculously finished, walks inside and sees somebody else's stuff. Captain Jack isn't there. So what does Dr. Flick do? He throws his stuff out the street. Well, Captain Jack then returns and he's angry. Now, in the good old Western style, you would think that Dr. Flick and the poet scout, Captain Jack, would have a gunfight on Main Street, would you? But they didn't. I guess a poet and a doctor don't gunfight. But they did do the right thing. They went to a miners' court, and miners' court is an informal court of arbitration. Pitched their case at who owns the cabin, and the miners' court decided it was Dr. Flick's cabin. And so he got to move in. That's what Andy Talent tells us. That story's been repeated many times, even in the book about Captain Jack Bofford. I cannot find a verification of that story anywhere in any 19th century newspaper. So I don't know if that's a true story or not. If it is, what did our friend Watt Parker say? If it isn't true, it ought to be, something like that. There we go. So it could be true. And also, let's a couple other discrepancies or a couple of interesting things about this cabin. I'm really beating this cabin to death, and I apologize. But the local stories about Dr. Flick says he stayed in Custer and would minister to the ill of Custer until the early 20th century. In fact, I read newspaper stories that have him in Rapid City in the 1880s. So I think he left Custer pretty damn soon after the gold rush and came to Rapid City. And the second note is that in one of the restorations of this cabin, they started taking the logs apart, and they found a hollowed-out log that had 2 revolvers and a shotgun hidden in it. And they don't know whose they are, but they took them out of the log, and they're on display now at the 1881 Courthouse Museum in Custer down at the lower level, and if you were curious about looking at those. Now, Custer did have plenty of other old cabins that were saved. I accidentally saved, and one of these is also in the courthouse, just behind the museum under shelter. And this cabin here was originally part of a house just north of the Courthouse Museum. A house had been built around this cabin, and in 1881, 1980, geez, I'm getting the date of the courthouse in there. In 1980s, the people that owned this house started demolishing the house. And lo and behold, as they demolished the house, they said, there's a cabin in here. And they found this cabin. They said, that's got to be old. It's got to be one of the original cabins in Custer. And they're right, it's an old cabin. So they donate it to the museum, and they haul it and put it under cover at the 1881 Courthouse Museum. This could be as old as the Flick cabin, we just don't know. But it is an early cabin. As you can see up there, it says printing shop. As a little sign on it says by the door, no printing was ever done in this cabin. Instead, it's a printing shop, as Paul Horsted told me, because they got on display inside old presses from the Custer Chronicle newspaper. So that makes it the printing shop. Well, this cabin, we don't know how old this is, but it easily could be as old as the supposed Flick cabin. But if we're talking about old cabins, the first direct to the Black Hills, there were a couple other options. How about this cabin? This cabin's out by Bear Rock. And Bear Rock's about 1.3 miles west of downtown Custer, not too far from French Creek. And what does Bear Rock serve? It was a location marker. When the Cheyenne Mining District was created by the prospectors along French Creek in early 1875, you need a location marker. We measure all our claims from this point. And that's what Bear Rock was, the location marker. And they built this cabin in front, and supposedly that's where the claim recorder lived. And this cabin could have been built, according to the records, or the secondhand stories, March 1875. Oh, that predates the Newton Jenny cabin even. Certainly predates the Way cabin. And one author claims it was the first cabin built in the Black Hills. Oh, okay, it could be. It didn't last long, it disappeared in 1880, so it's not a surviving cabin. So it is gone. And you can still visit Bear Rock, it didn't disappear. It's behind the house, behind a car shed, and there's a sign in front about it being the location station. It has the date 1876 on it, but that should say 1875. If you're looking for old cabins, where's the logical place to go if you're around Custer? You think about some of the earliest cabins erected. Well, I would think about the Gordon Stockade. The Gordon Stockade, as it's seen in its modern version, is just, of course, as you know, east of Custer. And the Gordon Stockade was built by the Gordon Party, that makes sense, in late December 1874, early 1875. The Gordon Party was the initial party out of Sioux City, Iowa, that wanted to take advantage of the early gold rush, the gold that Custer discovered that summer of 1874. The Gordon Party was composed of 26 men and one woman, Annie Talon, the person who writes our history, I guess, early on, and her 9-year-old son. They arrived here late December, built a stockade out of 13-foot poles, which they sunk into the ground. Part of that, they built seven cabins, 3 along each side wall and 1 along the back. So these cabins were done by early 1875. It easily were predated everything we've talked about. And you can go inside the stockade yet today, and you can see this sign here, but can't see it very clearly in this picture, and it says, "Historic Cabins Stay Out." And you say, "Oh my gosh, I found cabins from the Gordon Party." Oh no, you didn't. It doesn't really say that. It's not clear about that. Let's talk about the provenance of what we see there at the Gordon Stockade today. The Gordon Stockade was built in a very marshy area along French Creek, very close to where Custer had camped. And it's marshy, and the logs rotted. And in fact, I was trying to figure out when the stockade actually disappeared. And I found a quote from Robert Talent, Annie Talent's son, in 1886. He said, and he's 21 years old then, he said, "I'm really sad to see that the stockade is entirely gone." And this is just 10 years, 12 years after the gold rush. The stockade was gone. Well, that didn't stop people in the 1920s wondering about the stockade. In the 1920s, as people nudged into 1924, 25, 26, they said, we're getting to the 50th anniversary of the gold rush. And that becomes a big event in the Black Hills. A lot of things happen and we're worried about celebrating or commemorating the gold rush. And so in 1924, they said, we want to find the stockade, where it was. So who gets involved? The President C.C. O'Hare of the School of Mines. You know, he loved history, although he was a geologist by training, I believe. And he went out there with a group and they dug holes and they found the rock bottoms of posts. And they actually dug them up and put some on display. And I'm not sure where, if any are displayed today, but they put some on display. As they located the location of the post, people in Custer and the Society of Black Hills Pioneers said, we need to rebuild this damn thing. So they did. In the summer of 1925, they put up a stockade. But it had a weakness. They only used log slabs. They didn't use whole logs. And the area where the stockade was still a pasture. And animals, cattle, cows kept bumping into the stockade, rubbing their backs on it. And within 10 years, it was a wreck. And the moist ground kept taking its toll on it. Well, come the Depression and the New Deal and all the government work programs, somebody had the idea, let's build a damn thing. So finally getting federal money, the state worked with them. They got a survey of what the stockade looked like. They measured out where the stockade was supposed to, and the CCC in 1941 built a new stockade. And many of you probably remember that stockade. I visited the first time in 1973, 4, somewhere in there, and it was a tough shape. It had the leads, lots of wires holding it up, but it was there. And then come the turn of the century, 1990s, the state said, we're knocking it down. It's a hazard, and a local outcry happened in Custer. Baby Paul River was an outcry. And instead of knocking it down, well, they did knock it down, but they built a new one. And that's the stockade that's down there. For a mere cost of $825,000, a little more expensive than the Gordon Party originally put into it, they built a new stockade, which they restored 4 of the cabins and left 3 historic cabins. Now, what era are these cabins from? I don't know exactly, but I'll bet you that this is from the 1941 version of the stockade. I'm sure that's the cabins they left behind, which are still historic. 41, that's 80 years old cabins, but they're certainly not the original Gordon stockade. But think about the Gordon Party built cabins there in January 1875, making them the earliest in that area. But who knows? Other cabins were probably built someplace around there, but the Gordon cabins are not that, well, 1941 is still plenty old. And they've done a very nice job restoring it. If you haven't visited the Gordon's Dock Cave, I like it. That we're going to do this a little bit chronologically. What was the next town with gold rush? Hill City. And this is a picture of Hill City. And you think that Hill City is a gold rush town, the second town that found gold, would have some gold rush cabins on display. They don't. That we can really identify as a gold rush cabin. They do have this cabin in Allen Park, Tracy Park, named after Charlotte Tracy. In fact, her dad, Bill Tracy, this was his cabin, was out on his property in Allen Gulch, a half-mile west of Hill City. It's estimated this cabin was built in 1890, a little after the gold rush. Why wouldn't any earlier cabin survive in Hill City? Well, a couple of things come to mind as I speculate about this. One is, Hill City was essentially abandoned when it went bust in the early 1880s. And then, more so than Custer, because Custer became the county seat of Custer County, had some life, had more ranching, more logging. Hill City goes boom. The old story is, who was left in Hill City in 1880? An old man and a dog. But then it came back to life in 1885 when the Harney Peak tin excitement came along, and when the railroad came through in 1890, you got another boost. And when you have a town come back to life, and you want to build a new building, what do you do first? You find building supplies. Where do you find those? And all the abandoned buildings. And so the abandoned building was probably ripped apart and burned, if not put in other buildings or burned. So that's one reason. Another thing, that Hill City did have a couple of devastating fires. But this cabin that we see here is early. It could be earlier in 1890, but it's very nicely done with dovetails and inlays in the gables. It's probably more of an 1890. But as they say in Hill City, it's the oldest remaining building in Hill City. Is that true? Well, I don't know, but I would say this building is 1885 across the top is probably older. And in fact, this building at the corner of McGregor and Main is from 1885. That predates the other building by 5 years. This building, which was just recently known as the 1885 restaurant, had gone through the Desperados and other namesakes, was built in 1885 by a German immigrant named Canelo von Verman. He constructed this for saloon and sleeping quarters, and then he opened a newspaper in 1890, and for 20-some years, he ran, 30 years almost, he ran a newspaper, the Harney Peak Mining News, out of here. He left in the 1920s, went back to Germany, and this building became a dance hall, a saloon, a gift shop, fishing shop. In the process, it was expanded, got stucco on the walls. So the logs were covered by stucco. And nobody knew at that point. By 1975, that was actually a log building. By 1975, origin was a mystery. Then they had a building fire. And as they tried to restore the building, they lo and behold discovered the logs. The owner wisely said, well, I'm going to figure out the history of this building. And he called the State Preservation Office, and they rushed over to check it out. They said, you have an old log building here. Now, they came up with this conclusion. It's the oldest hand-hewn log commercial building in South Dakota. The oldest hand-hewn building, and it could be. How do you prove that? I love the caveat. It's not the oldest hand-hewn building, it's the commercial building. You throw commercial, and that's a whole different caveat. So maybe that's what gets away with that. But nevertheless, it got put on the National Register in 1977 with that language, using that as a good explanation. We'll go with it. Okay. It's a nice building, and glad it's safe. Not from the gold rush, but it fits in with our story. The third town of gold rush, as we all know, was Sheridan, originally known as Golden City. Of course, it could have had some preserved cabins. It could have been, for a while it was a hot spot. It was the county seat of Pennington County for about 9 months. This picture shows the first courthouse of Pennington County. Grenville Bennett, the first federal judge of the Black Hills, held the first federal court in Sheridan. And so it was a hopping town. Even when the county seat was moved out of Sheridan, and a lot of activity there. There was some hard rock mines, a trail went through there, and there probably was some remaining buildings, but they all disappeared because we know why. They were under the waters of Sheridan Lake, and so it could be that somewhere under Sheridan Lake is a cabin that could have been preserved, but is gone now. And the same true with Pactola Dam, drowning out Pactola. Well, the next gold rush town, and maybe some of you will see your town as a gold rush town, is Rapid City. Now, of course, there was no great gold discoveries in Rapid City. But why did John Brennan and Sam Scott leave their claims on Palmer Gulch in February 1876 to come and establish Rapid City? It wasn't just because they were freezing their butts off up there at Palmer Gulch in February 1876, which they were. It's because John Brennan, of course, had lived in Denver for a number of years, and he saw this location on Rabbit Creek as the next Denver of the Black Hills, servicing the mines. So he, Sam Scott, and others came down at another point, and party joined them, and camped under the Point of the Rocks down by Founders Park, and laid out the new Denver of the Black Hills, which they called Rapid City. And started this, what I call a gold rush town. Well, in this gold rush town, this is what they envisioned. And this very nice map here is done by George Mansfield, a true Black Hills Rapid City pioneer, who I've got to research more. But he defines what early Rapid City looked like, at least Rapid City in the summer of 1876. This is a map of Rapid City in the summer of 1876, looking north. The creek is back here. You can see Rapid Street, Main Street, Omaha Street would be about in there. We'll talk about the stockade and the lively rendition of a horse and rider there. What we have here is also identification of some important homes. Sam Scott, as we know, Sam Scott was the guy that laid out Rapid City with his pocket compass. That's why you use pocket compass, it goes to magnetic north. That's why downtown Rapid is off kilter to true north. But thanks to Sam Scott laid out a square mile town from north to never mind. Hit the wrong button. I got myself so excited about Sam Scott. But anyway, his cabin is number 9 here. You can see number 9 on the far right. And then let's see, you got Brennan's cabin is number 2. Right there's where John Brennan built his cabin. And then a guy that wasn't part of the original party, but did come soon after, was a guy known as Rufus Pat Madison. And his cabin is number 11. And so this is the origin of the Pat Madison cabin, as shown on this map done by George Mansfield. This map, as I mentioned, this also shows the log blockhouse built downtown Rapid at the intersection of 5th and Rapid Streets. What happened in the summer of 1876, the Indians who were coming back from the Battle of Little Bighorn were coming back to the agencies in northern Nebraska, were sweeping around the Black Hills, taking out their angry at all the trespassers. And 4 people were killed just outside of Rapid City. 9 people were killed on the trail to Rapid City. That made the people, about 200 people who lived in Rapid in August 1876, fear for their lives. So they built that blockhouse. And I should say 18 men and 1 woman built the blockhouse. The rest fled. And so amongst those 18 men that stayed was Pat Madison. And so he stayed to protect his home. There was no more violence in Rapid City, and the blockhouse would be taken apart in 1879, the logs used as for a jail. But we do have the Pat Madison cabin right outside here. If you haven't looked at it, do. And this cabin has an interesting provenance. One thing, how was this cabin saved? Well, Pat Madison moved out. He didn't hang around Rapid City long. After he survived the Indian scare, he decided he wanted to be a rancher/farmer, so he went out and homesteaded some land. So he left the cabin behind. And John Brennan acquires it, the town founder John Brennan. And he uses it as a barn for a number of years. After he uses it for a barn for a number of years, the property changes hands. John is gone, but his widow, Mrs. Brennan, decides, we needed to save that cabin. And this is the 1920s. We're very worried about history in the 1920s. And in 1926, they convinced the property owners to donate the cabin to Rapid City's Fortnightly Club, very important club at the time, led by Alice Gossage, the publisher of the Rapid City Journal. They took ownership of the cabin and moved it to Hadley Park. And there they restored it and did such things as put a fireplace on the back. I assure you, pioneer cabins seldom had fancy stone fireplaces. They may have had a metal pipe sticking out the roof, but they didn't take the time to build stone fireplaces. Those are affectations that are generally added later on. Well, it goes to Howley Park. It's restored after serving as a barn for about 30, 40 years. And then ultimately, it is moved out here to the Journey Museum in 2012. Better security, better visibility. Now, what kind of claims are made about this cabin? When it was moved to Howley Park in 1926, the claims were said, this is the oldest building in Rapid City. Of course, it's got to be said. And of course, not everybody agreed with that, and as long as that story circulated, in 1941, the Rapid City Journal had enough of that story and wrote an article saying, contrary to general belief, the cabin built by Rufus Madison was not the first to have been built, but is now the oldest. So he said, Sam Scott, who surveyed the town with his pocket companies, built the first cabin. Madison's followed, but of course Scott's cabin's gone. So it's the oldest surviving cabin. In the argument of first cabins, and this was 1926, lo and behold, Rapid City found another old cabin in 1926. They were building the Rice Building on Main Street in 1926, at 619 Main Street, and as they ripped off the siding of this old building they were tearing down to build the Rice Building, they discovered this cabin inside. And lo and behold, the excitement built, and they said, probably the Rapid City Journal in February 1926 said, this must be the oldest log cabin in Rapid City. And of course, this is the same time they're saving the Madison cabin. So a little argument ensued. And I'm not sure what they settled except the Madison cabin won out. I researched this cabin, and I've discovered that it was not built until 1877 by Charles Roberts, who put in a restaurant and a bakery. But it's gone, of course. If you probably can't see this from there, maybe you can. It says Calamity Jane occupied this at one time. I don't know that. She could have. She did spend the winter of 1879-1880 in Rapid City. And during that winter, did she live in this cabin? Sure, why not? The Gold Rush town we're all most familiar with is probably, I'm talking too much, is Deadwood. And how many historic Gold Rush cabins survive in Deadwood? Out of all the cabins that structure built? Oh, none. And why is that? Fire of 1879, that's a damn good reason. Bugs. Floods, that's the reason, 1883, yeah, that's for sure. And another reason is when you're in a tight quarters like this and keep building, you tear down what's there to build a new building. If you look around Deadwood, though, there is a cabin that is classified as a Gold Rush cabin that has been listed on the National Register. And this cabin sits about 2 miles east of Deadwood. It's on private property, and I won't give away the owner's name because I might say something disparaging here about it. But this cabin was listed on the 2012, and 2012 was put on the National Register of Historic Places. The State Preservation Office came out of this cabin. It sits right along Two Big Creek, so certainly it could have housed prospectors during the gold rush. And when the State Preservation came out here and looked at the cabin, and they said, yeah, it's old. And their conclusion was, it could date back to 1876. Okay. But they noted that on the roof were these lids that were traditionally called cyanide can lids, and those didn't come around to 1902. Well, how does that change the date? Well, to them it doesn't. It says those could have been added later. Okay. It got on the National Register with speculation it was built in 1876. So let's say we're going to go with that. Okay. So Deadwood does have, or at least close by, a Gold Rush cabin. The owner has heavily modified. And I was just out there, this picture was taken a month ago, and you notice this cabin looks like it's ready to collapse, falling in, the timbers are rough. It looks authentic, doesn't it? This looks pretty damn modern. And I asked the owner, who showed me around, I said, did you check with the Preservation Office in Pure about if this still can be registered or listed on the register? He said, yeah, it's good, they're good with it. Okay, so it's a nice cabin. He uses it as a retreat, and he told me the next time I had to come out here, I had to bring old log cabin whiskey or something, and we sit inside and drink. So I guess that's the rules. And the next town of the Gold Rush I want to touch on is Lee. And we don't really have any cabins about Lee. And why wouldn't we have any gold rush cabins from Lee? A lot of cabins were built, but where were those cabins built? On the open country. So, oh, there they go. So Lee, they're tough luck for a cabin to Lee. The last gold rush cabin has not really been preserved or saved. But if you go to Galena, town from 1875 or 1876, if you ask a local who knows something about their town, you'll say, where's the Thomas Walsh cabin? They'll say, that's the cabin. They'll point to this. And if you read Mildred Fielder's Silver is the Fortune, and she writes about Galena, she has a picture and says, this is the Thomas Walsh cabin. An important cabin, she says. He became, who was Thomas Walsh? The most successful man in Galena's history. Was he successful in Galena? Oh, no. He was an unsuccessful prospector in Galena. He lived there like 1877, 78. Once he failed in Galena, he went to Colorado like many prospectors did. And how did he do in Colorado? He kicked around for a while, but ultimately he discovered the Camp Bird Mine. Camp Bird Mine out of side of Ouray is magnificently wealthy. He made a fortune his daughter inherited. And she inherited so much money from the Camp Bird Mine of Thomas F. Walsh. She was able to buy the Hope Diamond, a bluish stone valued at over $300 million today, 45 carats, which she then donated to the Smithsonian Institution. So that's how much money Thomas Walsh made. And we could say it started in Galena, right? It looks more, if you go visit there, it looks more like a barn today or a garage, but it's there. Well, how much time do I have left, Mark?
Do just a couple more minutes.
A couple more minutes?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to talk about this cabin because I got stories about this one. And then I'll run through some slides just pointing out other cabins that I found interesting. This is a transportation cabin. And this is, again, in Custer behind the 1881 Courthouse Museum. And the sign on it says, this is the 12-mile ranch and stagecoach stop. And it was established by Joseph Hemphris, who arrived at the gold rush. It was located 12 miles southwest of Custer in Pleasant Valley. It provided services to stagecoach stops, beginning in early 1877. Okay. Is that true? If you listen to me by now, you should know it's not true. First, it says Joseph Hemphris arrived at the gold rush, and he did. He did. Did he go to Pleasant Valley then? No, he didn't. You read his obituary, he spent the first 10 years of his life in the Black Hills in Denver. He didn't show up down in Pleasant Valley as a resident until 1887, 10 years later. So he had visited there before. He knew the area, and he ultimately built a ranch, a 12-mile ranch in 1890, but he didn't build this cabin. The cabin did exist historically, though. And this is a picture from the Rapid City Journal from some time ago. This is from 2000. Actually, another picture from 1951. That shows actually a sign in front of it that says, Stagecoach Stop 1876, 1877. So that sign says for 2 years it was a stagecoach stop on the Cheyenne Trail. That is probably true. Okay, we're going to admit that the stagecoach stop was there 1876, 77. 77, the stage no longer ran through Pleasant Valley. It went around the sides of the hills. So it lost its purpose. Ultimately, it probably was incorporated to Hemphris Ranch. Ultimately, he did own what became the stagecoach stop. To throw more confusion into this is this man from our dear friend Watson Parker in Black Hills Ghost Towns. He said, be careful when you look at 12-mile ranch, he says, because here's Custer, look, there's a 12-mile station to the north, and there's 12-mile ranch to the south. Don't be confused. But in fact, I'm pretty sure that this cabin came from 12-mile ranch and not 12-mile station. One more thing I want to say at the same time, our friend Bob Lee wrote, and I just got to interject this. He was excited about this cabin, and he wrote, this cabin rivals the Wade cabin for the honor of being the oldest in the Black Hills. Real Bob Lee, he was a great historian. I'm sure, never mind. So Watson, back to Watson's story, he points out that this, that this was at the Hemphris Ranch. But then he says, Hemphris laid out the ranch in 1890 as a stage stop. Was there any stagecoach running through the valley in 1890? No. And how do we know that for a fact beyond even hesitation? By 1890, the railroad was running into Custer. And if you were coming from Edgemont to Custer riding a stage, you had a screw loose. You could get on the train at Edgemont and ride to Custer. Maybe. A couple other quick stories with this cabin, which is an interesting cabin to visit in Custer if you get there. Who knows this guy? Jesse James. And of course, Jesse James was involved in a bank raid and a robbery, what they call a raid in Minnesota called the Northfield Raid, in September 1876. As two of his gang members were killed, but he escaped. And in part of his escape, he supposedly jumped his horse jumped the 18-foot span of Devil's Gulch by Garrettson, South Dakota. Can any horse jump 18 feet? No. And so we're all sure that he didn't do that. But some stories say he did that, and he came coming west, and as he came west through Dakota, he stopped at this ranch and spent the night. In fact, there's another article in the local paper that says he was seen camping out by Newcastle. Who knows? Maybe that's true. I don't think so. One last note here about Hemphris is this sign that's 6 miles north of his ranch. Is this sign still there, Bo?
Yeah, as far as I know, I haven't been up there.
I haven't been down this road for a long time. But this sign says that the last buffalo hunt was, the last buffalo killed in the Black Hills was killed by Bob Patterson, Charlie Sager, and Hemphris at this location. Okay, this is my age. How do you know it's the last buffalo? Did you check every nook and cranny? Okay, so I'm sorry I talked too long with the stories I had, but I guess I just digress. The other cabins, if we get back to this, I'm going to talk about this guy's cabin. These are homestead cabins. Who was this guy? This is Buckskin Johnny Spaulding. And what do we know about Buckskin Johnny Spaulding? He built this cabin up at, which is now in Belfouche, at the Belfouche Museum. It originally sat on the plains on the Redwater River. He built it in 1876-77 for his sister who lived there in 78. And then ultimately the Helmer family would end up donating to Belfouche in 1960, and it was ultimately moved to the museum. It was called the Showplace in the Mountain, because he put in actual roofing tile and stucco the walls. Anyway. This cabin, another homestead cabin, is at the High Plains Heritage Center in Spearfish. Does this look like a cabin to you? There's no damn window in it. Would you build a cabin with no window? That's because for 80 years, it was used for a cabin like for 15, 20 years, then for 80 years it was a granary. They stored grain in it. So it's heavily modified. It's deemed a homestead cabin. This is the flag homestead cabin at the Newell Museum. 13 years the family lived in and outside of Newell and donated them to the museum. This is the Meeker cabin on the Meeker Ranch outside of Custer, which you remember the Forest Service wanted to knock down. And finally, this is the homestead cabin, which was never a cabin. A woman outside of Newcastle, this is Newcastle, wanted to honor women homesteaders. She remodeled a chicken coop to make this cabin and donated it to the museum in 1877. Other cabins I find interesting, which we talk about another time, tourism cabins, those by the Jusso brothers. This is in Deadwood, Lower Deadwood. The community cabin in Spearfish Park. The community center cabin in Custer. Branch A by the Jussos just across the border in Wyoming. Hardy Ranger Station, or Hardy Guard Camp, built by the CCC. Can't go anywhere unless you're talking about Badger Clark and Black Hills in South Dakota Canyon. His cabin. A few log structures that exist that aren't cabins include the Nemo Church, built in 1922 by the Finnish Swedish log workers that worked for the homestead. The 1930 chapel at Mystic. The 1960 chapel at Custer, the 1992 school in Keystone, and the 1885 school at the Heritage Center in Spearfish, Crow Creek Valley. And finally, not log structures, but wood structures, 2 jails out of 2x4s, interesting technique. This one's in Hot Springs, and this one is in Sundance. Never did hold the Sundance Kid, though. Well, that's all I have. I wish I could have time to tell the stories about those. And I got plenty of stories, but I thank you for your attention and thank you for putting up with this little wandering tour.